My name is Justin Stang. I am currently a policy analyst for the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association, which is to say that I think my primary role is as a liaison between the commercial shellfish growers and a lot of the state regulatory agencies. So, for example, when the commercial shellfish growers have meetings that conflict with tide runs, I would go to those meetings and sort of report back, and vice versa with the growers and the state agencies. So very rarely is there shellfish legislation, but pretty frequently there are regulatory changes that folks need to be aware of so that they're in compliance with all of the relevant state and federal laws. Uh, I should say that I'm relatively new in this role in that I've done it for about a year and a half. Before that, I spent 10 years at the Hama Hama Company, which is a commercial shellfish operation on the Olympic Peninsula in Lilywop, Washington. And my role there was as the wholesale and sales manager. So I was an oyster salesperson for about a decade. About 5% of my role at Hama Hama was in public relations, government relations, and compliance. And it was really my favorite part. I loved going to Washington, D.C., and advocating on behalf of the environment and on the shellfish growers. And so when this position opened up at Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers, I decided to make the leap into what is now my home office as opposed to the oyster farm, and to really give this a try because I feel like the work is exceptionally valuable in shaping how we talk about shellfish farming, how we steward the environment, and what kinds of things we can do moving forward. And to that end, I should say, I once gave a 5-minute persuasive speech on how I believe oysters and shellfish can save the world. And I love being at the intersection of food and climate mitigation and local rural jobs. I feel like whenever I go and speak to elected officials, they always say, we wish there was a way that we could feed people, protect food security, mitigate the effects of the changing climate, and give people jobs. And I'm always jumping up and down saying, I've got an idea. I've got an idea.
So are you
Yeah,
kind of a
Manfred.
lobbyist? Yeah, are you a
We
lobbyist?
I am technically not a lobbyist. We do have a contract lobbyist that we work with, but the way that Washington State is set up, in order to be an official lobbyist, you've got to check a bunch of boxes, and those boxes are mostly around going and advocating in offices for specific pieces of legislation. I generally only go at the invitation of the agency, and so I'm not really moving. And you also have to do it more than 4 days a month. And we go like 4 days a year where we're actually in front of elected officials advocating on behalf of the shellfish industry. And to
Okay.
that, I should note that our contract lobbyist mostly just keeps tabs on what sort of legislation things are working on so that we can see if it'll have an effect on shellfish and if we want to weigh in. I'll give you an example. Up in the San Juan Islands, there was a piece of legislation that was active last year and is going to come back, I think, moving forward about changing the fuel that some of the larger cargo ships and cruise ships use. Because right now they can scrub the discharge from that fuel and then discharge it into either Puget Sound water or offshore water. And I think that from a marine ecosystems and environmental standpoint, that we want to make sure that nobody is adding any elements to the marine environment that could be harmful for either human or marine life. And so things like that, as they come up, we sort of keep tabs on. I'll get into it a little bit later, but the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association was founded in 1930 because down here in Olympia, there were a lot of pulp mills that were causing pollution in the local area, and the oyster farmers sort of banded together to sort of put some regulations in place that would sort of stop some of that pollution as it was happening because the Olympia oyster was declining in population, and they thought, boy, we've got to get a handle on some of this pollution. And that work still sort of happens to this day, where we're doing a lot of monitoring of sort of rainfall closures, septic discharge, stormwater runoff, things of that nature to say, we'll be the canary in the coal mine, if you will, and we'll alert folks when we think that there's something that could be or should be on people's radars to protect in the marine environment. There's kind of a long and short answer on the contract lobbyist front, but we do work with them. Ultimately, the way that the government works is that you've got to sort of tell your story, and that's largely what we like to do. We love to have farmers or shellfish growers explain what it is they do and why it's important, and then we hope the rest kind of falls into place by saying, hey, this is a really important thing for jobs, for the economy, for food. We want to protect it as best we can to make sure that the environment isn't changing in a way that doesn't allow for a healthy ecosystem for shellfish, and we kind of take it from there. Moving to the things I'm going to talk about tonight. Now, my experience is primarily in commercial shellfish, so a lot of these things might not be applicable to recreational harvest, to shellfish gardening, or to sort of home personal usage, unless you are looking to sort of take your farm into the commercial space, if that makes sense. I think, and I hope that it's interesting and something that you all find interesting. However, it might not be applicable for, oh, that's beautiful. Gooey duck chatter sounds amazing. It might not necessarily be applicable for your site or your particular usage or gardening or shellfish operation, if that makes any sense. But I'm happy to share my screen, go through some of the commercial aspects and what it is that we look at, and the things that I do with the association. If you have a question, feel free to interrupt me as well. And just as a disclaimer, not an attorney, not giving anybody solid regulatory or permitting advice that they should count on or hang their hat on. And I should note that coming from the sales and wholesale operation and now working in the policy space, I've actually never permitted a farm myself. So I don't want to say that, like, I can give you loose parameters on what it looks like. But if anybody did want to permit a farm, I would put you in touch with folks that I would consider to be far greater experts in the space, if that makes sense.
Why would they want to be a member?
Oh, of the association.
Yes.
Yeah, we find that there's a lot of strength and safety in numbers when we get folks together to advocate for a common cause, despite the fact that most folks grow either different species or live in different locations. The common theme is sort of environmental quality, water protection, and sort of a healthy environment for shellfish growing. And so what tends to happen over time is that if there's a really important issue, we see that our membership will swell a little bit, and we'll get a lot of more participation. And then when things tend to be going good, sometimes people kind of fall off. So I think a lot of it depends on what sort of issues we're really focused on and how urgent those issues are.
They were super instrumental in mobilizing people in the fall when they were trying to increase the permit prices for all of the operations. It was like a 10 times increase that they were trying. And so they were able to get a reduction in that. Still pretty significant increase this year, but thanks for all your work with that, Justin. Really mobilizing
yeah.
people.
And
It makes sense.
yeah. No, we never have, like, anytime you have an organization, we never have what I would consider to be like a fully unified voice, because nobody agrees 100% on everything, even shellfish growers. But I think it's good to have, when you're disseminating information or you're collecting feedback, I think it's really good to have, an organization. This is PCSGA is a nonprofit trade organization, so we're able to relay information from state agencies to our members and back in a way that just sort of expedites the process and keeps things pretty clean. I hope for both sides in order to keep things moving along efficiently and correctly.
It's also really hard for a small grower to keep up on all the issues.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's what
weapon.
PCSG
Yeah.
does for them. So it's a
Yeah.
valuable
And
tool.
yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about that sort of kind of as we go later on. But let's hear. So Emily, can you see the screen that says shellfish policy permits and the growers behind you?
Yep.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right.
Can you see this?
Yes, I'm good.
Okay.
So very quickly, we'll cover a little bit about regulation, a little bit about policy, a little on permits. I'll try to touch on some safety and licensing, and then get into PCSGA and what we do. And then we'll talk about some of our partners and the other people in the greater shellfish space. And I might move a little bit quickly just to make sure that I don't go too far on one slide or take up too much time. But if you ever at any point need to go back, I can certainly go back, and as questions come up, we can focus on those as well. All right, why shellfish are regulated the way they are? I think that the main thing here is that shellfish, when I say shellfish, I'm talking about molluscan bivalves. So oysters, clams, which would include gooey duck, and mussels. Those are the primary species that PCSGA members, grower members, commercial grower members focus on. And let's see, we represent grower members in 5 states. So I'm going to talk primarily about Washington, but every site in Washington is site specific and a little bit different. And of course, we represent Alaska, Oregon, California, and Hawaii as well. But particularly in the oyster space, they get their own sort of special treatment because of a couple of things. One, they're filter feeders. So as they're filtering, they can pick up whatever is in the water. Traditionally, a lot of oysters are consumed raw. So if they do pick something up from the water column and they're consumed raw, they do have the potential to cause illness. And in the event that they do cause an illness, that illness can be damaging or troublesome to the growing area that those oysters came from, or for the market and the trust in processes. This is particularly true for smaller farms, because even if they didn't do something themselves, that could have a big impact on what it is that they're trying to do there. So we've got layers of government at the federal, the state, and the local level, all that play a part in the shellfish policy world. Let's see, starting with the federal level, there is and we'll get into this a little on the next slide, I believe, but what they call the ISSC is the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference, and they are a cooperative body that sort of oversees the NSSP, which is the rules and guidelines by which people harvest shellfish. So the FDA sort of oversees that, but the ISSC is a cooperative endeavor with the state regulators, the federal regulators, and the shellfish industry. The 3 entities all work together to keep an eye on and to update this NSSP, which is the governing document for shellfish harvesting. I should also note that obviously the Environmental Protection Agency, the folks at NOAA, and the Army Corps of Engineers also play a role in the national landscape, because, for example, if you are using shellfish gear and it is in a navigable waterway, the Army Corps of Engineers would need to permit to satisfy the U.S. Harbors Act. That is to say, they've got sort of the overarch of the umbrella. The day-to-day programs are delegated to state authorities. And in Washington state, that's the Department of Health. So you've got this program, National Shellfish Safety Program. It's then delegated to the State Department of Health to follow those guidelines. However, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Ecology, and the Department of Agriculture all play a role in some of the regulatory space as well, depending on what it is that you're doing. If your operation calls for the need to have DNR or Fish and Wildlife, and most of them do to some extent need to check some of these boxes. And then at the land use and shoreline spot on the local side, there's regulatory as well. For you all, I believe it would be Island County, and that is with respect to your shoreline master management, your shoreline master plan, the Shoreline Management Act, that sort of dictates your local rules that would stipulate what it is you can do or build or operate there. And all of these things at every level, they're fluid. They do change. And so from year to year, what is currently in the Shoreline Management Act, that gets updated periodically through the county. And then when those rules go into effect, new farms that were trying to become established or get permitted would have to follow suit. And the same for the Department of Health, for example. As Emily was saying, they had changed their commercial shellfish licensing fees, but they also changed the shellfish sanitation rules so that as you're harvesting shellfish, they've got specific requirements or guidelines that you have to follow. And as those are updated, you've got to modify your operations to stay in compliance. So that NSSP is the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. That is, when they say voluntary but universal, that's state by state. Most of, if not all of the coastal states do participate. If you're in, North Dakota, for example, and you don't have anybody harvesting shellfish, you might not be participating in the program. And what it does is it puts together an MOU between the FDA and this ISSC organization that guides the program, and they come up with this NSSP guide, the Guide for the Control of Molluscan Shellfish, what I refer to as the Commercial Shellfish Bible, which tells you everything you need to know about how to legally harvest shellfish and sell it. This is particularly true and important for interstate shellfish commerce. Because each of the states has bought into the same program, you have this uniformity across state lines. It's not that people harvesting in Louisiana follow one set of rules and people in Maine follow a different set of rules. Because they've all volunteered to participate in a uniform program, everybody's following the same rules, which makes it really consistent and easy from municipality to municipality and locale to locale. So the federal system, as I was saying, it's made up of the FDA, that Interstate Shellfish Conference, which happens every couple of years. They get together and examine the rules and make changes as is needed. The Environmental Protection Agency looks at water quality standards. NOAA does a bunch of the aquaculture science and coordinating, and they also do a lot of permitting support for growers as you're going through the process. And then your official permit in the commercial world for shellfish does have to be issued also from the Army Corps of Engineers. They have physical farm structures and gear. So if you were going to put in some sort of tumble farm or structure, that would certainly fall into their purview. Growing area classifications are a way that they examine each body of water and area to determine its water quality and whether or not that water quality allows for the growing and harvest of shellfish. They have them in a few different categories. Approved, meaning you can harvest and sell directly from the body of water. A conditional area, which allows you to sell when the conditions allow. There's a restricted area, which means that you can't necessarily sell unless you do something to treat that product. And then there's prohibited areas where, due to pollution or perhaps some other factor, they determine that you should not be harvesting commercial shellfish for sale. Now, I should say we have these conditions, and they vary from geographic region to geographic region, but these are also, as part of the NSSP, built for the entirety of the country. So right now, for example, we might not have treatment of oysters from restricted areas in order to sell them, but that might be relevant in another state.
Okay.
All right, getting started, the permit path. There are a number of steps to taking your shellfish farm from a garden or a hobby farm to having it become a commercial entity where you could sell to a restaurant. And they start with just series of regulators. A lot of this is starting to learn who the players are in the field and what you might need from them. And all of these boxes sort of need to be visited at some point in order to permit your shellfish farm. That's the Washington State Department of Health, Ecology, Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife, Natural Resources, and Island County itself. The DNR part is more relevant if you are farming on state-owned aquatic lands, of which it has a few million, maybe 2.6 million acres across Puget Sound. So some Whidbey area shellfish beds do involve leases from the DNR, but not necessarily all of them. Some of you might have private tidelands, which is something that is unique to Washington as well. The fish and wildlife folks, they matter when you're bringing in those baby oysters. Right now, with a garden, you can go to a public seed sale and get oysters, I believe, that you can put out on your beach. However, if you want to do commercial quantities with tracking, Fish and Wildlife comes in to permit the movement of oyster stock between sites. And they would register you as an aquatic farm and make sure that you are doing all of the things to prevent any disease or invasive species from moving around Puget Sound. The Department of Agriculture does more on shellfish as agriculture and marketing. At Hama Hama, for example, we had a program where we would shuck and smoke oysters, and the Department of Agriculture would inspect our smoking operation to make sure that as we were selling the packaged final good, that it met their standards. And then, of course, the local government, Island County, they control the shoreline permit. So you'd have to go to them to build a relationship and have those contacts working in order to have the shoreline permit issued. Of course, DOH, the Department of Health, is our main contact for shellfish safety. They issue your shellfish license and conduct inspections. Depending on what type of license you have, it changes how frequently they need to have those inspections. And so they're a main point of contact, particularly for food safety.
What is the smallest size of commercial production that you have? Like what is the range of the commercial productions? Like how is it measured in output, the number of oysters they produce every year, or is it measured in acreage of ocean water that they use? What's like the smallest commercial customer you have?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we have there's an oyster farm in Hood Canal that started out as a gardener. He's got less than a half acre, and he wanted to see his oysters that he was working so hard on growing represented in restaurants. And so despite the fact that he is a very small geographic area and he's not producing very many oysters, a few thousand dozen per year, he did go through the steps to permit the farm and get a shellfish license just so that he'd be able to sell them commercially and see them on restaurant menus. So it can be very, very small, micro farm. Obviously, from a business standpoint, it can be a little bit tricky to have a very small output generate enough money that would sort of justify the permitting and regulatory process. But it's not unheard of to have some pretty small farms. I should also say that for the Pacific Coast shellfish growers, for our association, most of our members are what I would consider micro businesses, owner, operator, mom and pops that primarily have day jobs as a pilot or work in state agency or pour concrete or something like that. And they happen to own tidelands and use that shellfish as sort of a side hustle, if you will, or a secondary business opportunity for them to get outside, do what they love, which is growing shellfish, and to try to make a little bit of money as well.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so there are a lot of very small farms, and depending on how much tideland you have access to, you can grow a good bit of oysters without an exceptional amount of tideland. A lot of it depends on time and space and energy, and what. I think that shellfish farming is so site specific that certain areas grow shellfish really quickly. Certain areas are a little bit slower, depending on wind and waves and geographic location. I think there's a ton of factors, but we've definitely seen some small farms producing more oysters or clams than you'd expect out of that, which I think is pretty cool. But yeah, they don't fit all in a box. There's quite a big variety of sizes, but most of them are really, really small.
Okay.
But on the other side of that, most of the fees that support PSGA come from the large growers.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah, we have a handful of larger operations that certainly do a good bit of the funding of our organization because we are member funded. All right. This says 8 steps to a permitted farm. There may be more than 8 steps, but generally speaking, you've got to scope your site. You have to fill out this JARPA, the Joint Aquatic Resources Permit application. Then there's local review with the county. There are federal permits. There's DNR if you happen to be on state-owned tidelands. Depending on the scope of the site, it'll also determine tribal review and if you need to coordinate with affected tribes on their treaty rights. Then there's the DOH Shellfish Operator License, and then the Aquatic Farm Registration with Fish and Wildlife. So there's an awful lot of hoops to jump through, and a significant amount of, this is kind of a much easier flow chart. NOAA actually has a flow chart for permitting a shellfish farm in Washington State, and it's a pretty wild flow chart to take a look at because it's quite complex, which is why I said earlier that anybody that really wanted to go through the permitting process, I'd be happy to connect with someone that's done it on a much more regular basis that can walk you through the complexity that's involved in each step. Each step also has a time frame and a cost associated with it that can really vary depending on what it is you're trying to do from the site, the scope of the site.
What is the average cost for like a mom and pop place? Do you have that number?
I don't. I wouldn't want to speculate and give you any bad information, but I can try to gather some information. You know, there was a report that came out relatively recently that I'm still working through that talked about sort of shellfish farming being sort of 8 times more regulated and quite expensive. However, I'd want to find somebody at the smaller scale and get their perspective and figures that are maybe a little bit more accurate to knowing. I know there's a lot of steps and it can be costly, but that's all relative. I don't know if that's like, you know, a few dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? So I could certainly get you some more info on that.
Well, the Department of Health permit alone, if you're 0 to 50 acres, right, that's like several $1,000s right there.
Yeah, if you were just a harvester, if your Department of Health shellfish license was just under the harvester, I think their lowest dollar amount license is maybe $600, $650 currently. And that would only allow you though to sell. You could sell to Emily. You could only sell to a licensed dealer. Then you couldn't sell directly to a restaurant. You could only harvest the shellfish and then pass it off to another bigger shellfish entity, like a wholesale dealer or
Yeah.
Some
yeah.
plant, processing plant. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. But I think you could get a harvesting license for roughly $600 a year. Then what Emily was talking about before was that the harvester license used to be just $300 a year, and they were going to have it go up to roughly, you know, thousands of dollars per year. And so for someone that was just doing a real small amount of shellfish, it was pretty cost prohibitive. And we were able to find some compromise there with the legislature to help us out and get that, at least for the next couple of years, in a dollar amount that allowed folks to continue that operation. So this is just, I'll kind of fly through this, but a little more detail on the scoping, on the JARPA, local government review, you know, matching your JARPA against the shoreline management plan, and then being issued a permit from the county, and then scoping your federal regulatory permits. Most of the shellfish farms in Washington State have what's called an individual permit, so it's based on your specific location and what it is you're doing. But that one can be the longest of the steps, getting the federal permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. And then if you're on DNR, you've got that state aquatics land. If your project is coordinated with affected tribes, you've got to make sure to have respectful and early engagement with them to check all the boxes that are relevant to making sure you're following the treaty rights. And then DOH operator's license is great. You can ultimately send them an email or reach out to the Department of Health and say, I want to license a shellfish farm, and they'll get you going. You can if you're on private title land, you can start with there. You can reach out to the Department of Health and say, I want to start a commercial operation from my private tidelands and get started on that part of the process first. However, you know, you do want to scope the site and make sure that it's going to work out in the end before you go and apply for a license and pay for it with the Department of Health without the other boxes being checked. But I would always recommend sort of checking in with somebody that's permit expert or has gone through the permitting process, a consultant, if you will, which is not something I am really qualified to give guidance on. And then, yeah, aquatic farm with fish and wildlife is the other step. And then, yeah, it can be, there's, 8 steps here according to NOAA. The timeline could be months to years, depending on the site that you're looking at and the difficulty, along with how many other permits are currently in process and what the staffing and the permit clearing sort of looks like from agency to agency, which can vary depending on what it is they have going on. And then, I think some of the things that are important are reaching out to and in that learning process and the scoping and consulting with neighbors, with the county, with the tribes sort of early and not waiting until public hearing process to find out you've got someone next door that really doesn't want you having a commercial operation, even if that commercial operation is microscopic. You never know. And so you always want to build those bridges with the community beforehand so you don't have extra time or delays on the back end. All right, the DOH shellfish license and food safety. So every day you harvest shellfish, and I think this is currently true up there, even if you're in the gardening stage or the recreational stage, is that you want to periodically, before you harvest, and that could be daily if you're harvesting daily, check in with the Department of Health to make sure your growing area is open and approved and that there aren't any biotoxin closures, rainfall closures, or if in the summertime there's a naturally occurring bacteria called Vibrio parahemolyticus, and you want to make sure that you're following all of the recommendations and regulations and rules around shellfish harvesting with the Department of Health to make sure that the product that you're eating or selling is safe for human consumption. And so the DOH is monitoring these areas for all of these things. And when you're a commercial shellfish grower, they would have you on a list serve. And once you have a license, they would say, hey, there's been for example, in South Sound, when there's an exceptional amount of rain at the Olympia Airport gauge, they close a body of water nearby there and they call everybody and let them know, hey, no harvesting shellfish. They also email everybody. And so there's a great partnership between shellfish growers and the Department of Health to relay that information back and forth. And their online resources are quite robust and helpful. Right now, for example, there are a number of shellfish growing area closures in Hood Canal for paralytic shellfish poisoning, and it's a testament to the food safety program that the department runs and the way that the commercial shellfish and even in this case recreational harvesters are following, because knocking on wood, they haven't had any illnesses associated with that closure, which is the whole idea that if the food safety system and the communication system is put in place and followed correctly, that we should be able to mitigate or eliminate risk for human consumption.
Yeah, makes sense.
And so the state has a lab in Shoreline, state of Washington. They do a lot of biotoxin monitoring, and by that they have a program called Sound Toxins that they work with that looks at the microscope in the water column to sort of see what type of algae is blooming in the area. And then that would trigger testing of mussels or clams or oysters, and then monitoring that over time to make sure that if something does happen and there is a harmful bloom, that the biotoxin triggers a closure and then everybody is alerted.
Sego has 3 questions.
Oh yeah, Sego, go ahead.
Yeah, so going back to that last slide,
Yep.
so I've always been curious, so I'm looking at the recreational beach map right now, or closure area, but you were talking about commercial closure
Yeah.
in Hood Canal, I think.
Yep.
So how does that work? Like, what happens to all those shellfish farms during a closure? Or like if there's a closure at Penn Cove with the aquaculture set up there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So traditionally, what will happen is and this is no offense to our recreational friends. The state of Washington will close recreational areas first. And it's simply because the general public has less knowledge and information than the commercial harvesters. The commercial harvesters are also participating with and communicating with the Department of Health on a daily basis to monitor and test product. So they'll close the recreational. If the levels are dangerous, they'll obviously close the commercial as well. And what happens is that while the Hood Canal is closed, if you had a small operation just in Hood Canal, you can't harvest the oysters, clams, or mussels. Right now, it's closed to all species. And so they're just not generating any income. It's actually been quite stressful. There was an article earlier this week in the Seattle Times about the difficulty. It's now been 6 weeks of closure without shellfish sales during one of the highest demand and busier times of year. And so a lot of these companies, particularly the smaller ones, are holding on for dear life to try to make it through. And they'll be able to sell the shellfish eventually once the bloom subsides. However, that shellfish will be bigger, and they might be selling barbecue oysters instead of raw half-shell oysters.
Yeah, I had that happen with some of our oysters a couple of years ago where like we lost the whole summer to harvest. It's like,
Right.
oh my gosh, I've got a lot of big oysters now.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
not
second
ideal.
question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I
No,
don't
I'm
know if
saying
there's
it's not ideal, but the food safety comes first. So you want to make sure everybody's safe. And then, hopefully we've sort of alerted folks to the difficulty here. And I'm hoping that someday we can build out a program for USDA or the state of Washington to be able to provide some relief to those farmers that have been losing income as a result of something that's sort of natural and has it's not normal for it to happen the way that it has this year, but it's definitely caused a pretty big disruption to the economic side.
So I don't know if you can comment as to the truth of this, but I heard some scuttlebutt that some adjacent tribal commercials were not affected by the closure.
No, I did see that online, and they are 100% affected. They have to follow all of the same rules. They've got to send samples to all of the same laboratory stuff. I felt like some of the forums I saw online, they were getting kind of a bad rap. Some people are even trying to defend that they have more robust testing, and some of them might do testing, but no, they are from the commercial standpoint held to the same standards that any of the other companies are. And a lot of that's like, hey, this is a
Are they
public
close
safety
enough?
issue that could cause some pretty serious illnesses. So we want to make sure that nobody's consuming any shellfish from these affected areas.
So
But
you're saying that the tribals are closed down too then?
yeah, one of the things I noticed though is that right now Hood Canal is opening back up, and so I think a lot of the confusion was around the tribal harvesting did resume, but it's because those areas had closed. But it's not open in its entirety. There's sort of a checkerboard pattern because you have to have a series of tests that are free and clear of any biotoxin before you can open that area. And so it's opening in a weird fashion. But if there were a commercial entity in that open area that wasn't tribal, they'd be harvesting now too. At least that's as far as I've seen.
So the ASP, is that, so I've never heard of that. Has that ever resulted in closures for crab harvest?
Yeah, it has, and I don't want to. My memory is that if you remember the blob from a few years ago, that was a big domoic. There was a big domoic acid, and that was on the coast. But it is something that happens. Although I can't say, there isn't necessarily any like predictability behind the when and the where, but there have been less so for bivalve shellfish, oysters, clams, and mussels, but certainly for crab, and I believe domoic acid closures have happened on the coast of Washington for crab harvest.
Okay, and then the DSP, is that only Vibrio or is that something else too?
No, that's something different. That's a biotoxin, with the difference being that these are biotoxins and
Oh,
Vibrio
these
is a
are all
bacteria.
biotoxins. Got it.
Yeah. So that one is something that they've seen a little bit more of it recently in certain areas, but it's not nearly as it's still something to be cognizant of, but not nearly as deadly as paralytic shellfish poisoning. And so it's something that's that seems to be a little bit newer on the frequency chart. But there have
Hey,
been a
while
couple
my
of
mic's
couple of
open and you're
closures.
talking to me, let me do my last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when I went down to Oyster Fest last year, where I met you,
Right.
on the way there, I saw there was someone selling oysters alongside the road.
Yep.
And we stopped, tasted his oysters. They were all on ice. He had thermometers and stuff, and they were local oysters. And, when I was an Evergreen student in the 70s, there was a Nisqually woman who you could get a bushel of oysters for $30, and we'd have these oyster roasts. And I thought, how cool is this? Someone is still like making cheap oysters available because they're really inexpensive. So
Yeah.
we ate so
He,
many oysters at Oyster Fest that I had thought about buying some, even though I have my own oysters, because they were so cheap and be oysters from someplace else that I could eat. And then I was too full and didn't want to deal with it. So I was telling a friend about this, and she said, "Oh yeah, like that's a smart thing, buying oysters along the side of the road from a beach that you don't know anything about, and with the septic systems right above it, and all that." So I was just wondering what you or Emily would have to say about that.
I can speak to this exact grower because I know the guy and that you would have bought those oysters from. And he is a fully licensed commercial operation through the Department of Health, following all the same rules that any of the larger companies are following. But he just so happens to be a really small owner operator on Hood Canal, and so it's easier for him, and the business is better for him to throw everything on the cooler on ice and transport it a little bit closer to town where the traffic is better for him to sell than for him to stay out in the remote rural location. But it's every bit the same commercial operation that Emily would have to follow or any of the other wholesale dealers have to follow. It looks a little wonky because it's still old school side of the road, but 100% following and up to code. And I know this because I called the Department of Health because somebody had said to me, "Hey, there's a guy selling oysters on the side of the road." And I thought, well, that's a little odd. We better make sure that he's following all the rules for food safety. And so I bumped into somebody from Department of Health and I asked him, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's so and so." And then I was like, "Oh, okay, that makes total sense. They're fully up to snuff on all of those rules and regulations, and they do get regular Department of Health inspections. So it looks fly by night, but it is anything but."
Sego, you can
Thanks.
always ask them to show your harvest tag. If they can't
That's
show
Okay.
right.
you the harvest tag, then I wouldn't buy the oysters. But if they can show you the harvest tag, then they've done everything they're supposed to do.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And
that's exactly right.
they should also have their Department of Health permit, like up-to-date permit from that year with them while they're selling it. So ask questions always.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that's always fair, which is to say, a question or two goes a long way, especially if you're in a position where you're a little more knowledgeable than the average consumer, and you can say, "Hey, if you're selling oysters to the public, you're supposed to have some paperwork, or some documentation or some shellfish tags that support that you're allowed to do this."
Mhm. Okay, we got maximum 5 more minutes.
Okay. Okay, Vibrio is a bacteria, naturally occurring bacteria, happens in the summer. This is only really important because if you have a commercial shellfish operation, you have to also institute what's called a Vibrio control plan, which notes how you'll modify your operations in the summer to mitigate the warmer temperatures and the naturally occurring bacteria. And a lot of that means that you have, excuse me, you have generally rules and regulations about harvesting oysters and the time and temperature that you have to follow when you do it. And those change a little bit in the warmer months to make sure that you're keeping the oysters as safe as possible for human consumption. So, like you all were saying, the tagging, the records, and the cold chain are exceptionally important. You need to have basically a plan in place and records that demonstrate that you've taken them from the water, cooled them appropriately, and kept them refrigerated or on ice. You also need to have shellfish tags that support that documentation, and they need to be kept on file so that you can make them available for the department in the event that they request them. All right, PCSGA. We were founded in 1930. I mentioned earlier that was primarily to look at at pulp mill pollution here in Olympia. We represent 5 states on the West Coast, and members grow molluscan bivalves across the Pacific Coast with primarily grower members, about 100 or so. And then we also have allied members that are sort of oyster shellfish industry adjacent. So they would supply rain gear or boots or things like that. People that rely on these companies for their livelihood. For example, somebody's got to print the shell stock tags and then sell those to the commercial harvesters. And so those folks could join the association. One thing that I'd love to hear feedback from you all at a later date is sort of about what it would look like to have a shellfish gardening membership, $30 a year, and you could be up to date on what it is that we're doing. And I don't know, there'd be a way to incorporate sort of people that love shellfish and love shellfish either eating it or growing it and want to stay up to date on like the latest news and sort of what's happening.
Great
I'm
idea.
in Olympia because that's where state agencies are, but we're fully remote at this point. We no longer have an office officially. PCSGA does support in 4 different ways. We advocate for the growers. We work with ISSC on food safety. So I'll go to that conference and work with them on rules and making sure that the growers understand how to keep compliant and safe. We also were instrumental in the founding of the Pacific Shellfish Institute. We have research priorities every 2 years that we try to get students at various universities to look at issues that we're currently facing. Right now, a lot of the oyster science world is working on sort of disease resistance and mitigating climate change in the hatchery setting so that we don't have mass mortality events when the weather changes. And then, of course, we build community, connect members, help wherever we can. We share resources and have an annual conference where we try to bring everybody together and share information and knowledge. And then beyond PCSGA, we have a bunch of other folks that we work with. The ISSC I mentioned, Pacific Shellfish Institute, is a research arm of the shellfish world that does a lot of scientific study. We work with Washington Sea Grant quite a bit, and they do the sound toxins program that monitors some of that biotoxin stuff. And then, of course, NOAA Fisheries is also a partner. And then Puget Sound Restoration Fund, they're doing a lot of work right now in restoring native Olympia oysters. I think for anybody that's trying to get oysters reestablished there on Whidbey Island, they're a fantastic resource. And let's see, tribes. We've got a lot of work that we do with tribes and keeping up to date. Some of these folks here, like Jamestown, Sklallam, Swinomish, Skokomish, Nisqually, are members of the association. And then we work with the East Coast Growers Association, which is our counterpart on the Atlantic, and the National Aquaculture Association, which sort of brings everybody together under one sort of bigger umbrella. And then I was a founding member of the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition, but it's not currently active. And that was an advocacy group where we were using storytelling to sort of raise the alarm that as the climate's changing, it's making it difficult to grow shellfish. And then I've got a slide here just with key contacts if you want more information from either Department of Health or the permitting folks, PCSGA's website. And I'm sure that, Emily, we can get this information to anybody that needs it after. And of course, this is me, and you all can send me emails anytime, and I'll try to do my best. If I don't know the answer, I can find out who does and try to connect you appropriately so that you can go from there. And with that, and maybe a few minutes over, that's the show.